Hello and welcome back to my course on Sustainable Land Management. Please check the introduction to our first class where I told you about the course and what the objectives were. I explained about the references and I introduced myself. Now last time we looked at the relationship between climate change and land. Now we're going to move on to sustainable land management and its enabling environment. That simply means a set of high-level, for example, policy, strategy, factors that make SLM easier to achieve. I term these pull factors. I'll start with knowledge management and capacity building, move on to incentives, then gender, land tenure, marketing, and finally value addition. They're not the only factors that underpin SLM, but they're all key. Here's a graphic that I hope will help. You will see that those 6 factors that I've just mentioned form an outer circle with 4 main themes as a circle within. And effective sustainable land management is at the core. So let's take a look now at knowledge management and capacity building. Well, knowledge management and capacity are an obvious requirement for good SLM in order to let it thrive and to spread. There's a great deal of knowledge held by land users and scientists alike, but how can it best be shared and how can decision making be supported? Local or indigenous knowledge can be uncovered by participatory exercises. Here's an example from Cambodia, where students of mine were investigating attitudes to various types of technologies through focus groups and scoring and ranking exercises. And now to global level. I've already introduced you to WOCAT, that was back in class 2. WOCAT houses the online global database on SLM, with more than 2,000 practices documented from over 130 countries. Furthermore, WOCAT provides tools and methodologies to document SLM in the field and to make choices about practices. WOCAT has also produced state-of-the-art publications on all aspects of SLM. WOCAT gathers information on technologies and approaches. Here's an example from the book that we've just seen, describing the technology of natural vegetative strips. That's from the Philippines. And here is the corresponding approach. That's land care. An approach describes the ways and means that a technology is implemented and/or promoted. Knowledge is not simply confined to practices on the ground, but any knowledge that can help, including information and communications. Early warning systems are being installed in many countries, supported by advances in remote sensing. They are often linked to advice, which is then sent out by phone-based messaging or by radio. This helps people know, for example, when rain is expected, so they can better plan planting. I've already mentioned mobile phones, but will do so again. They are extremely important devices for spreading information. The graph presented here shows the exponential increase in uptake of mobile phones in sub-Saharan Africa. But the internet has not yet reached nearly as far. What huge potential phones have for messages about SLM. And I'm proud to say that I've recently become involved in helping an NGO to develop messages for SLM, from phone to farmers in the field. The next enabling factor we'll look at is incentives. Incentives make for a fascinating topic. How can you ensure that an incentive has its intended impact? Too often I have seen recipients of incentives becoming addicted to handouts, the dependency syndrome, if you like. I love this quote from Francis Shackson. Incentives, are they starters, bribes, shared costs, rewards or compensations? Olivier de Sardin takes a darker view of what sometimes happens with incentives. Here's my classification. Direct incentives are given in return for activities, usually immediately and to individuals. Indirect incentives are often for the general benefit of communities. Well, in practice, incentives are most useful when they help kick-start action by removing a bottleneck. For example, in a project I worked on in Kenya, people urgently needed heavy-duty hose to construct terraces. The project supplied them. In contrast, I've seen many examples of what I've just mentioned, the dependency syndrome. When assessing the success of incentives, we must ask, do they reinforce SLM in the long run? Of course, ideally, the best incentive isn't a handout at all. It's the land user benefiting from the SLM practice itself. The key is to link SLM with productivity and to minimize handouts, at least in the long run. In the 1980s, I witnessed extraordinary scenes of how food for work was being misused. The recipients were required to build massive bunds of earth to harvest water in areas where they'd never cultivated before. They'd only herded cattle there. They were rewarded by food rations. And yes, as you've probably guessed, as soon as the food relief was stopped, the people downed tools and moved away from the area, leaving the massive structures to fall into disrepair. Some 30 years later, I saw similar approaches being adopted by an outside agency. But when I mentioned this, the agency in question became quite indignant. Lessons learned is a phrase much used, but seldom heeded. Here's a similar approach that I witnessed in Gujarat, India, some years later. Local people were given social welfare relief to build earth dams. But some of these dams were so poorly and dangerously sited, they were destroyed voluntarily by the people themselves after completion. Productive safety net programs, such as those used in Ethiopia, seem to be incentives that make more sense. The community projects appeared to me to be better planned. Now, smart subsidies are another form of incentive that can be used to reduce the cost of vital inputs, but they arouse controversy. Those opposing them will use the twin arguments of dependency and destroying market mechanisms. Okay, we've seen how knowledge management helps create an enabling environment for SLM. And we've considered the role of incentives. That brings us to a third enabling factor, gender. When I began my career in the early 1970s, gender was barely talked about. Since then, huge steps have been made both on ethical grounds, you cannot favour men and forget women, and also for practical reasons. Women are sometimes the drivers of SLM projects. Remember the terracing groups that we talked about in class 2? Here are some data from EFAD. Women constitute over 40% of the agricultural labour force in developing countries overall, and more than 50% in sub-Saharan Africa. Bottom left are women involved in a non-farming rural activity, weaving shiondo baskets from sisal in Kenya. I bought a couple myself, and 25 years later I still use them regularly for shopping. Many years ago, I asked a farmer in Burkina Faso if I could photograph his full grain store, and this was the pose he chose. And here's a picture I took of some women in Senegal. Intriguingly, they were observing a lively discussion between their husbands and some progressive Western development workers, both women and men. Their body language spoke volumes, I thought, about marginalization. Over the years, there's been a variety of gender-based approaches, each with its own acronym. But the common denominator has been to actively include women's concerns in SLM and other types of projects, and to make sure that women receive, well, at least an equal level of benefits. I was on a mission recently with Chiara Romano, a gender consultant working for IFAD. This was in Egypt, and we visited a dairy project. Chiara and I started to talk with the women, and then Chiara said something rather profound. It takes 4 hands to milk a cow. What she meant was this: both a man and his wife are equally involved, so women should receive equal attention and training as men. So, we've covered the first 3 enablers. Now it's on to security of tenure and closely related rights to resources. Security of land tenure and the rights to natural resources such as water and forests are crucial to successful SLM. Without rights to resource use, not necessarily ownership, land users are unwilling to invest. In Ethiopia, rights awarded to pastoralists have led directly to better management of pastures and re-emergence of original biodiverse vegetation. Sometimes private, consolidated property isn't what people want. In southwest Uganda, I was shown how people like to have several plots across the transect from valley to hilltops. Below they can have a banana plot, mid-slope cereals, and then on the hilltops cattle can graze. In China, things are changing too, and production levels have benefited. Here's a list of points for you to look at, but maybe the last point needs explaining further. I came across a project in northern Somalia, now Somaliland, where farmers took advantage of a project's offer to bulldoze bunds to create water harvesting structures. But many of those farmers didn't even plant the plots. They just wanted to stake an ownership claim to the land. Some of you might have heard about regreening in the West African Sahel. Trees have reappeared in places which had become bare. The 2 main reasons for this were increased rainfall, permitting heavily browsed stumps to grow out of reach of goats, and in Niger, the government allowing people the rights to trees on their land. Here's a familiar story. I trust that you remember earlier in the course we discussed joint forest management as a way to restore the forest. Handing over responsibility to people to manage the forest has made a fundamental difference. And, as we noted in class 3, there's a lively debate about the rangelands, at least in Africa. Is it better to A. divide savanna land up into private ranches for the few and maintain good ecology, or B. allow groups of pastoralists to make their own decisions while risking overgrazing and loss of animals in droughts? Various compromises have been suggested, but they need stakeholder negotiation to make them work. We have examined 4 pull factors, factors that can support SLM. So that now leads us to inputs and marketing. In 2006, I was invited to evaluate the Desert Margins project across sub-Saharan Africa. While traveling with the well-respected project manager, Dr. Thabo Ramajita, I asked him what was the single most important factor holding people back in Africa. Marketing, he simply said. Marketing is crucial at both ends of farming, so to speak. Access to inputs needed for planting and feeding, and ways of selling outputs of produce. Market failures are perhaps the single most important constraint in many countries. Take the example of fertilizer. As you will recollect, it's hugely important due to nutrient mining. Remember class 1? But it may be too expensive, or indeed only available in large sacks. Here's an example of a shopkeeper who's divided a sack into small bags. Those are affordable to most smallholders. Physical infrastructure is essential also. The first photo is a poorly maintained road in Uganda. The second is a mountain pass that I had to use in the late 1970s to reach my home in the Kerio Valley of Kenya. The third is a bridge in Kenya which was smashed up, where a drift which allows overflow of water would have been much better, such as the fourth picture here in Madagascar. Savings and loan facilities can help small-scale land users to ensure that they have funds available at the beginning of the season to invest in inputs. I've talked a lot about donor-supported projects, but once the private sector, local businessmen and women, get involved in development processes, it can help farmers locate markets. Again, this is a clear example of a pull rather than a push factor. Here's a value chain that has been developed in Cambodia, with organic palm sugar leading the way. The circle in the first photo, by the way, is the farmer harvesting sap from the shoots high up the tree. One major stumbling block to commercialization in Africa, especially, is the lack of mechanization. Machines are vital for upscaling systems, such as conservation agriculture, but they must be machines that can be readily available, affordable, and can be maintained. Let's now cover the final major factor that underpins good SLM. That's value addition. In fact, we've had an example already with palm sugar in Cambodia. This last pull factor supports production that improves conditions for farmers and makes the land healthier. It's a reward for better SLM. Value addition is exactly that, adding value to products through what are sometimes called value chains. Better quality means higher prices. Organic production and ethical labeling are two of the ways that value can be added to produce, while simultaneously improving the land and the farmer's conditions. And that's good for SLM and good for livelihoods. But what qualifies as organic production? Well, it must be free from inorganic fertilizers, without synthetic pesticides or herbicides, and no genetically modified seed is allowed. And it must be officially certified through IFOAM, the International Federation of Organic Agriculture Movements. Here's an example of how an organic system of growing pineapples on a small scale in this case can manage without artificial fertilizer. A nitrogen-fixing legume, Canavalia, is interplanted within the crop. Organic production is defined by IFOAM as agricultural systems that promote environmentally, socially, and economically sound production of food and fibers. It is growing steadily in importance year on year, but still only covers about 1.5% of the world's farmland. I am using this graph as a proxy for the growth in non-organic production. As the world started adopting mechanization, irrigation, and improved seeds together with fertilizers and pesticides, then production increased very quickly. Initially in Europe and the USA, and then Asia came on board, while Africa remained largely organic and with low yields. But this has actually, ironically, opened up an intriguing opportunity. Africa can readily adopt certified organic production because much of her production is, well, basically organic anyway. I was in Uganda when the first African Organic Symposium took place. Here's the organic outlet in Kampala, the capital. When I first taught about organic production in Africa, I used this slide. But then, in 2010, the number of organic growers in Uganda was 50,000. Now it has quadrupled. This advertisement inside the shop caught my eye. Here's a clue to one key outlet channel for organic produce, accessing the niche market of customers who can afford high-quality produce. But it's not as easy as it might seem. It takes time to be granted certification, and because yields are low during this waiting period, income is also low because the higher organic prices are not yet accessible. It's not just food that can be organic, but fibers as well. For example, organic cotton is increasingly popular, especially since much of the cotton used in clothing these days is from genetically modified plants. Of course, many people grow organically simply because they believe in it. We've met Joyny before. His guiding principle was to farm as his grandmother had farmed, using, basically, organic principles. You will remember that I said in an earlier class that his mulching imitated forest floor conditions. Organic production depends not just on individual farmers, but on their neighbours too. Certification will not be allowed if pesticides are carried in the wind from next door. So if a whole island agrees to go organic, then that's one problem solved. You may have heard of, or even tasted, rooibos tea. In Afrikaans, rooibos means red bush, and driving through the Western Cape province of South Africa, I saw red bushes along the roadside. It was indeed rooibos. And here's an example of the produce, a photo I took a few years ago. Just look at the labeling, everything that you could possibly want in a product. A triumph of marketing, you could say. Here's a summary of the key points surrounding organic production. It's a huge inspiration to SLM and provides important basic principles for farmland, incorporation of legumes, manuring, mulching, agroforestry, and so forth. But do look at the last point under disadvantages. The world cannot currently be fed by a strict adherence to organic rules and regulations. That's basically because mineral fertilizers are fundamental to maintaining high yields worldwide, and synthetic herbicides and pesticides are currently essential too. But please read the reference so that you can understand better. Just to clear up any confusion, organic agriculture isn't just another term to cover SLM, it's a specific form of SLM. And organic agriculture isn't the same as conservation agriculture, because conservation agriculture demands minimum tillage and allows herbicides, pesticides, and in some cases genetically modified crops. But both organic agriculture and conservation agriculture are valuable forms of SLM, and they both enrich the land. Another way to add value is through fair trade and other forms of ethical labeling. This helps enable SLM because ethical labeling, like organic production, can be an incentive to better SLM through showing that we're prepared to pay more for sustainable practices. The issue here is more to do with ethical standards of production, that is, not exploiting farmers, rather than the health of the consumer. but of course it's often both together. To create a truly high quality product that's equitable, the labour producing it must be adequately and fairly recompensed. Just look at the quote on this slide that I've highlighted. The major impact of ethical labelling may be forging common ground in defining minimum social and environmental requirements. Since I started teaching, I've seen this impact slowly but surely occurring. Note here the difference between fair trade, 2 words, the principle, and fair trade, 1 word, which implies specific and controlled standards. Max Havelaar was the pioneer in fair trade, 1 word, and the FLO is the umbrella body that monitors standards. The picture on the left was one that I took in India towards the end of the 1980s. I was taken to see these smiling children making carpets. At the time, I didn't realize that this was child labor. In Europe these days, it is almost impossible to buy chocolate that doesn't have some type of fair trade label. It's becoming standard, a goal of those early pioneers. Fair trade is often combined with organic or sustainable production labels. This strengthens its niche market and implies, though doesn't guarantee of course, SLM throughout the process. Here are other examples of labelling. Origin-based produce is more of a marketing tool than a standard certification. Here's an example from Fiji. And a rather different example from Inner Mongolia in China. On now to the specific case of cocoa and chocolate. It's always great for me to see my former students go ahead with careers in SLM. Angela joined UTZ and now works for Hershey's in sourcing sustainable cocoa. UTZ has subsequently joined hands with Rainforest Alliance and has launched a joint certification standard. Before we look at our final example of chocolate from Ghana, here's how it's made. In English, cacao refers to the tree and cocoa is the processed product. First, cacao pods are harvested. Then the beans are extracted and fermented. Then they are roasted and ground to produce cocoa powder, and that is turned into chocolate. Ghana is a major producer of cocoa, the second largest in the world after Ivory Coast, and Ghana is also a pioneer in certified cocoa production. So just a reminder once again of the enabling environment and those 6 factors that we've looked at individually. And as ever, some take-home points. I've listed here again the 6 enablers. Finally, can we be hopeful about SLM? Well, here's a diagram we used in Class 1 to talk about land degradation. But we've turned the title on its head. Remember what we said? Nearly half the land surface is basically in quite good condition or improving. Sustainable land management is making an impact. This course has shown how that impact can spread. I truly hope this course has armed you with a strong foundation in SLM. It's only an introduction, but even so, there's enough here for you to help make a difference, whether it's through project design or at home within your own community, or both. I said at the beginning, and I've stressed throughout, that I hope that the course stimulates you to find out more. Don't forget the references. They cover every topic we've talked about. The glossary will help you with terminology, and of course WOCAT is the key knowledge hub and is constantly providing more information on SLM and how success can be scaled up. I truly hope that you've enjoyed the course and have learnt a lot. Please share and interact between yourselves, and above all, put as much SLM as you can into practice, either personally or in design of projects. Before I go, here's a huge thanks to all of those who have helped me develop this course over the years. A special mention to Sabina de Prima is heartfelt. There's my friend and colleague Aifka Malay and Kim Hagen too, and the team at WOCAT, Nicole, Rima, Mats and Gudrun, and most especially Hans-Peter Linneger. I mustn't forget my colleagues from the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, Chris, Stephen and Wendelin, and of course my understanding wife Ants. Finally, a huge thanks to Rachel Friesen, who has helped me shape this online version and invested so much of her time and energy. Rachel, I couldn't have done it without you. Thank you.